right. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the third in our Historic Neighborhood series, Lockerbie Square, Then and Now, the revitalization of Indianapolis's first historic district, presented by Marjorie Kienle. I'm Liz Ellis, Executive Director of the Indianapolis Propylaeum. A couple of housekeeping items. The best way to watch it would be in speaker view, and it's located up in the upper right-hand corner if you click that. And then if you have questions for Marjorie at the end of the program, if you could type them in the chat feature down at the bottom, we'll get to as many questions as we can. The Propylaeum was founded in 1888 by renowned suffragist and activist Mayrite Sewell as a place for women and women's groups to meet and share ideas. We carry on that tradition today through our mission as the place that connects and celebrates women. Our mission and focus is women's leadership, arts and culture, and historic preservation. As a nonprofit, we count on your support to provide engaging programming like tonight. Please take a look at our website, www.thepropylaeum.org, for all of our upcoming virtual events and to support the Propylaeum. We hope that you will join us at the Propylaeum when we're all able to gather together again in person. Our program tonight will feature Lockerbie Square, Then and Now, and I would like to introduce our speaker. She began her career as a speech pathologist. She's an avid preservationist and a community activist. Ladies and gentlemen, Marjorie Kienle. Marjorie, would you like to share a little bit about yourself?
Well, that's pretty much it. I will say that, historic preservation is a passion, and it's mainly because coming up on 55 years, I've been married to a preservation architect, and we've restored 3 houses together without killing one another. Now, that's a pretty major accomplishment in itself. But I have been president of Historic Urban Neighborhoods of Indianapolis, and I still remain on the board. So historic preservation in general is a side passion of mine. Lockerbie Square is a real passion. Ever since one of those 3 houses, 1976, you'll see it in the presentation. So I've been very passionate about the neighborhood and not just the structures, the people. We have great people in Lockerbie. Before I start, I have to thank some people. First of all, I would like to thank Helen Small, and I will be talking about Helen throughout this presentation. She and her husband Bob were pivotal in revitalizing Lockerbie after it deteriorated. But in doing so, Helen took pictures, photographs, as the houses, as people bought these rundown houses and to fix them back up. And without those pictures, you would not know the story of Lockerbie. You would come and walk through our neighborhood and you'd think, most people think it's a very attractive, delightful place. We have great people, but you don't know the story of Lockerbie till you see the pictures that Helen took. And we thank her for that, because as we've done tours of other historic neighborhoods, we just have the afters. We don't have the befores. I also would like to thank Dr. James Glass. Jim wrote the history of Lockerbie Square for our second historic plan from the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission in 1987. It's extremely detailed and complete history. I have to also offer Dr. Glass my apologies, because I have to just pull a few salient features out of that very detailed history. And so my apologies to him. My apologies also to some of my other urban pioneers from Lockerbie. Because of the time frame, I could not present all of the houses. So when we get into the befores and afters, just know it's a small smattering of the people who came down here to make a difference. Okay, for people, just to orient you, this is the downtown of Indianapolis, and it's the Mile Square. So you have North, East, South, and West Street makes a Mile Square. Lockerbie Square is right over here on East Street. Here it is. Now, as it developed, it was a square with College Avenue, New York, East, and Michigan. The upper half was developed by T.R. Fletcher, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And the lower half was developed by Janet Lockerbie McOuat. I do want to say, so when it became a historic district, then we enlarged the boundaries. So here's East Street. It actually goes to Cleveland, a small street 1 block west. It actually goes down here to Miami Street, 1 block south. It goes over to Davison, right up against the interstate. And it sort of goes along North Street. It kind of, it's, up and down on North Street because there were some people who didn't want to be in a historic district at that time because they didn't want to be told, they didn't want to have somebody tell them what they could and could not do to their property. The other thing that's important, I hope that after you hear this presentation, that you will come down when the weather gets good and the plants start blooming and walk around our neighborhood. And if you do that, just know that inside the square, it's resident only parking. And also on the on East Street and on the north side of New York, you can park on the south side if you can find a space. College Avenue, both sides of the street, and then Vermont over here between College and the interstate. You can usually find parking on that street. And sometimes along Michigan, right along there on Michigan. So we don't want you to get a parking ticket if you come down to visit us. We just want you to come visit. This is Janet Lockerbie McOuat. Her husband, Thomas McOuat, was a very bright businessman. And as soon as the Mile Square was laid out, and then the city started to sell outlots from there. And he bought some to develop as a developer. They didn't live in Indianapolis, but because it was just being developed, but he bought these plots to sell. Not Lockerbie, just some, it doesn't say exactly where else, but he planned to develop it. Then in 1838, and let's think about that because I'm going to orient you throughout this to the Civil War, which was 1861. So 1838 was pretty long before the Civil War. In 1838, we had an epidemic. Who knew? We had an epidemic and Thomas died, leaving Janet Lockerbie McOuat a widow with children. She's a bright lady. She just took on the business and continued to be the developer. She was the one who actually bought the land in Lockerbie, lot 15, which was the, if you look at that square I showed you, it's a quadrant. So she first developed the southwest quadrant. She laid it out, divided it into plots to sell to people to build houses, and laid out Lockerbie Street. The first house to be built is 727 Lockerbie Street. It faced, we felt, to the west. And if you look at that side, it has a pre-Civil War feel of a kind of a Greek revival. It was built by Mary and Obed Foote in 1855 and then passed on. They later sold it to Martin Ego, and in 1870, so now we've jumped past the Civil War, 1870, the owners added the front, which is Victorian with the large dormer and the porch, and faced it toward Lockerbie Street. Around World War II, the house became a legitimate boarding house. Now I say legitimate boarding house, which is where, usually a woman ran it and she cooked breakfast and dinner for businessmen and they rented rooms and then, went to work nearby. I want to highlight, we had several legitimate boarding houses in Lockerbie at that time. I need to highlight that because during World War II or shortly thereafter, along Park Street, just a couple houses down, was known as Liberty Street back then, and it was a red light district. And those were not legitimate boarding houses. When we moved in our house in the mid-70s, this was still a boarding house. And the yard was beautifully maintained by the woman who lived there and ran it as a boarding house. But it was bought by Mary Tarzian. Mary and Circus Tarzian owned a lot of radio stations throughout Indiana, and some of you may remember that. She bought several properties to develop in Lockerbie, and this was one of them. And she had the vision that she wanted it to be the mayor's residence, a formal residence for the mayor. But Hudnut was mayor at the time, and he just didn't quite buy it. He did live in Lockerbie later after he was mayor, but he didn't think that there should be a mayor's residence. So it sat empty for a long time, and the beautifully kept yards went to seed. They were kind of ugly, and the house just sat there. In the 1990s, it was purchased and totally restored inside and out. And an addition for an office, a glass addition over here, was added. In 2006, one of our Propylaeum members, Tina Pasquinelli, and her husband bought it. Tina lives there today, and Tina became a master gardener and has returned the yards to the beauty that we once enjoyed. I mean, it's from even in this kind of weather, these yards are beautiful. But from spring through fall through Christmas, the yards are just beautiful. So I hope you enjoy it if you come down and walk through our neighborhood. Directly across the street is the James Whitcomb Riley home. This was built in 1872 by John Nickham, he was a partner in a baking firm of Parrott and Nickham. When he passed on, he passed it to his daughter, Mrs. Charles Holstein. And in the last 23 years of his life, James Whitcomb Riley was a paying guest living there. When Riley died, they just locked it up. Apparently, Mrs. Nickham must have lived, or Holstein must have lived elsewhere, and they just locked up the house. There were people who got together to organize and raise money and create the James Whitcomb Riley Foundation, and made this a museum home. The foundation also has the museum home of his childhood in Greenfield, and it started the Children's Hospital. So that foundation grew to be quite large. Many of you, if you grew up in Indiana, went through the James Whitcomb Riley home as part of your, fourth, fifth grade. A lot of school buses are there. And so maybe you went through it as a child. If you didn't, or if it's been a long time, it's time to go through it again. It is very unique. When the National Trust for Historic Preservation came to Indianapolis a few years ago, well, maybe 10, the staff came out early and we took them through the Riley home, and they were totally blown away because, almost every major city in the country has a museum home. But what they are, they're houses that people restore, and then, if they're lucky, maybe they get the original family members to give back some of the furniture that had been passed down through the family, or china or pieces of silver or something. But then they furnish it by pieces that were of that period of that house. James Whitcomb Riley's house was never restored. It was preserved. It is exactly the way it was when James Whitcomb Riley lived there, and it's as if he just went out for a walk and he'll be back. I have a friend that says his DNA is still floating around in there. So it is really a unique and asset to Indianapolis and to our neighborhood. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It was put on in 1966. It's on the Historic American Building Survey in 1970, and it is a national landmark, which is the highest award that you can give a structure in our country, and there are only 43 in all of Indiana. Now, early on, we had a very strong German influence, so you can't talk about the history of Lockerbie without our German influence. Prior to the Civil War, Germantown was immediately south of Lockerbie. It went from Ohio Street to Washington Street between East and College, and it was filled with German immigrants. Between 1850 and 1900, more than 50% of foreign-born people in Indiana were German. So Das Deutsche Haus was built. It was the center of German living in Indianapolis and definitely in Lockerbie Square. You look here, you have a theater. You have the restaurant is here down underneath, and you have meeting rooms. And over here, they had the Turners. The Turners were a gymnastic group. And now where the Turners, used to be, it's the YMCA. And this is where Jim and I go. Again, it was Das Deutsche Haus. You may recognize it as the Athenaeum. In World War I, when there was very strong anti-German sentiment, it was the Das Deutsche Haus. The sign was taken down and destroyed, and it was called then the Athenaeum. A few years ago, when we celebrated 100-year anniversary of World War I, we returned the sign. Right here, you'll find it. And it now again says Das Deutsche Haus. Churches were also a big part of the German families of Lockerbie. There were many other churches, but two survive today. This is St. Mary's. If you look at St. Mary's, it is a Gothic construction similar to, it was designed along the lines of the Cologne Cathedral by Hermann. He was an architect from Chicago, and he came to Indianapolis to design the home brewery, which was huge on Washington Street. And one little small brewery building survives today behind, I think it's the Hardee's. But he came to design that, and he went to church at St. Mary's, which was on Maryland Street. And the priest introduced him to a family where he could live while he was working in Indianapolis, and he married their daughter. So as a thank you to the priest for introducing him, he designed St. Mary's. Pro bono was the story. St. Mary's, as I said, is a Gothic construction. It's one of the best Gothic constructions in Indiana. There are others, but you won't find them with all of this sculpture. It's unique in that regard. The second picture I'm showing you is to show you that after over 150 years, the limestone is starting to fall off, and all of this decorative limestone work is starting to fall or come loose. So this is the first $1 million that we've raised, and we've got to raise another $1 million to get the job finished, but we're trying to preserve it for the next 150 years. Also is the German Evangelical Church, or the German Methodist Church. It still stands on the corner of New York and Lockerbie, and was most recently known as the Lockerbie Square Methodist Church. If you look in this picture of when it was early on, you'll see also the German Lutheran Church, but that's gone. That's what happens. That ended up being a parking lot. So it was built in 1882 and remained active till the early 2000s. In 2015, Cyrus Jafari bought it and has turned it into an event center. So you can see, here's people in the old days walking down East Street. Here's a wedding party coming from Lockerbie Street walking down. It's a really beautiful event center. The stained glass windows are lovely. Okay, I'm going back to the map just to reorient you. Again, Janet Lockerbie McOuat, she developed this lower half, starting with the first quarter and then going into the second quarter, and the upper half between Vermont and Michigan and College and East Street was developed by T.R. Fletcher. Many of you remember the Fletcher National Bank. He was a developer, a banker, and a businessman. So he wanted to get residents. So we're going to look right here along College. One of the first houses developed was the Joseph Staub house. And it was the first house in terms of starting to bring Lockerbie back that Indiana Landmarks restored. Now, it was done in 1965, so that was very early. One of the descendants of Staub was H. Roll McLaughlin, FAIA, preservation architect. And this was his, I think, great-grandfather's house. Staub was a tailor, and he and his wife lived there and had their tailoring business there. They built it in 1859. So again, going back to orienting around the Civil War that started in 1861, you see that we're getting close. 1859, they started their tailoring business and living in this house, but he made a lot of money sewing the Union Army uniforms, so much so that he moved his shop to the Circle and then raised his family in this house. I'm going to do one other German in the neighborhood, just knowing there were a lot of Germans that in Lockerbie, but this one is Hermann Lieber's house, and Hermann Lieber was one of the founders of Das Deutsche Haus. He had a art and photography, sold supplies, art and photography supplies, and he had a gallery, and he was a patron of art. I was told that by Bill Selm, a local historian, that he, in his opinion, was the most important person in Indiana art history besides the artists themselves, and that he was a patron of T.C. Steele, and that had he not been, T.C. Steele might not have had the fame that he has today in Indiana. Now, I also want to show you this house for another reason. As we start talking about the restoration in Lockerbie, this one was done at the very beginning, and it was either right before IHPC was formed or right after, before they had staff, or before we had, definitely was before we had our historic plan guidelines to say what you can and cannot do. It does keep the unique wide eave board, and it does keep the brackets. Now, this historic architects, preservation architects, get a little annoyed at HGTV. So I'm just going to tell you right here, these are not corbels. These are brackets. Corbels are masonry, and they're sort of like a masonry bracket that kind of comes out, but these are wood and they're known as brackets. So it kept the brackets, it kept the wide eaves, it kept these vents. You can see it here, but look at the front. You had two doors with a single window, was a double divided down the middle. They made it into one house, which is fine. You can do that, but they have one door and two windows, and you cannot do that today. You have to keep the integrity of the history of the house if you come to restore it. And so today they would make you keep the two doors in the window. Okay, then along T.R. Fletcher's section of Lockerbie on Vermont Street, this is on the corner, was on the corner of Vermont and East Street. And we have several major historic Catholic structures. Five sisters of the five little sisters of the poor came in 1873 and put up a temporary structure on the corner of Vermont and East Street. In 1888, so you know that is we're getting about 15 years after the Civil War. They built this structure, and they had 60 residents. Later, they added stables, a wing for male residents, and of course, a chapel. And they cared for the indigent poor there until the 1960s. In 1961, the Indianapolis Star ran an article that was titled, "Little Sisters of the Poor on Vermont, Aid Aged in Crumbling Old Building." And so then lay Catholics across the city and the state raised money to build them a new location up on 86th Street. Then if we go to the other end of the corner, down to the corner of Vermont and Park Street, of course, back then it was Liberty Street, there was St. Joseph's Church. It's a small church. This back here is St. Vincent Hospital, the first St. Vincent Hospital. So this is a small church. Bishop Chittard had it built here for the Germans, but it became very ecumenical. They allowed Irish to attend as well, which was very ecumenical of them. But it didn't last very long because it was so small. So Bishop Chittard then built a new St. Joseph on College Avenue. It's now the brewery. Many of you maybe have stopped and had a beer and some snacks there. And then this was raised. So as you look down Vermont Street, we had Little Sisters of the Poor, St. Vincent Hospital, and then St. Joseph on down. They are all gone today. The only thing that remains from there is this brick wall. And it's solid from here all the way around. This is Vermont, down East Street, and then down Michigan. So when people in our neighborhood, or you walk around our neighborhood, you see that belonged to the Little Sisters of the Poor. On down Vermont Street, going this way, it was either maintained or replicated all the way down to the end of the street, so that piece was kept. In 1985, you see these townhouses were added, and that's when they protected this wall and then put in these kind of front areas. These were built as part of the Lockerbie Glove project. They are what the National Park Service calls of their own time. So when you're building, they want it to be contextual, but of its own time. So it's the brick matches the brick of, what would have been there, and limestone. So it was red brick and limestone, but it's definitely a 1980s style, 85. So Bishop Chittard, when he took down St. Joseph, which was right here, here's St. Vincent before it was taken down. Here's where St. Joseph was. When he was taking these down, he wanted it to be residence, but he passed away, and it didn't become residence. In 1909 to 1916, this is the Lockerbie Glove Company. The offices, or business offices, are up here, and those are now the penthouse units. And this is where the gloves were made. They were work gloves. By 1940, they actually owned the property throughout the square. In 1985, they moved to Mexico. My husband was the architect and worked with a developer he had worked with, and they turned it into the Lockerbie Glove condos. You have big banks of windows. The ceilings are 10 or more feet high. You have huge wood beams. You have brick walls. These are very popular even today with all the building downtown. People still love the condos in Lockerbie because of the charm they have. And then here you can see there's the Glove condo, and then you can see the townhouses that were built on the corner. Oh, I just had to throw this in because this is the shared deck for the condos. And I think it's the best view of Indianapolis downtown. I admit I could be prejudiced, but think about this for the fireworks on the 4th of July. It's just a fabulous view, but it's great just sitting up there having a glass of wine after work. Okay. After the Great Depression in the 30s, the neighborhood started declining. more rooming houses that were not legitimate. Remember, there was a red light district. Absentee landlords increased. As we continued after the deterioration continued after World War II, and we started getting a lot of boarded up houses with a lot of them with demolition numbers and a lot of empty lots. Serious thought was given to trying to revitalize Lockerbie. I mean, we had the James Whitcomb Riley home. It always was our foundation. You know, people, as long as we had that, you know, we had something special. So this idea that Disneyland had just been built in California. So some business people thought, and some people with the Metropolitan Planning Department in 1958-59 came up with this idea that we could have a Disneyland downtown around the Riley home. We could have blacksmith shops and, you know, bakeries. We could have 3/4 models of famous historic buildings from Indiana around there. And over here where I live now, we could have parking. We could tear all those houses down, which they started doing, and we could have parking. Fortunately, they never found enough money to do that, thank God. So in 1966, if you remember, that's when the landmarks started getting interested, and they restored the Staub house in 65. And in 66, and I'm going to say Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana. That's a mouthful. So it later became Indiana Landmarks. So during this period, it was Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana, but I'm going to refer to it from this point forward as just Indiana Landmarks, so you know who it is. They formed a Lockerbie Square committee to look at redeveloping the neighborhood. And they thought it should be developed along the lines of German Village in Columbus, Ohio. German Village is a much larger neighborhood, mostly brick structures, but it's one of the most successful restoration of a historic neighborhood in the country. And it's where Jim and I lived the first 5 years we were married. In 1967, Indiana Landmarks, their board members, and their Lockerbie Square committee members and the Marion County Historical Society were able to get a successful bill through the Indiana General Assembly, creating a 7-member Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, IHPC. The new law armed them with design review and control over existing buildings and over new construction. And so in September the 11th, 1968, Lockerbie Square became a formal historic district. We did not get our first plan, though, until 1978, and then it was followed up with a revised plan in 1987. But throughout 1969 and 70, Indiana Landmarks tried very hard to see if they could get banks to move here, bakeries, businesses. They wanted to get people to move in here, and businesses they thought were a way to do it, but nobody would do it. And as we move forward and you start seeing what it looked like in 1969 and 70, you'll see why a lot of the businesses did not want to move in here. So then the next step was to get people to come in and take these historic houses and restore them. This is 542 East Lockerbie, or the Henry Runge House. It was built in 1894 to 95, and it's a Queen Anne style. In 1945, the Indianapolis Day Nursery bought it, and they also bought this little house next door and turned it into the Day Nursery. Now, I do want to point out, and I will probably show several other places, you see small cottages next to big houses all through our neighborhood. We didn't have a street for the small houses and a street for the big houses. We didn't separate the rich from the tradesmen. They're all mixed together. And I just think that's part of what made Lockerbie great from the beginning. That this was the Indianapolis Day Nursery in 1945. There it is. In 1971, before 1971, they built a new facility on East Street, and so they wanted to sell it. And in 1971, this is what it looked like, and it was sold to Bob and Helen Small. God bless them. I think that this was the pivotal project, and it wasn't just Bob and Helen. The real visionary here was Justice Roger DeBruler. He was an Indiana Supreme Court justice. And he bought the properties. The property included this house, the little house, and then a big playground over on Vermont Street. He had H. Roll McLaughlin design a house for him and his wife on Vermont Street. And he convinced two of his lawyer friends that were young and energetic to take the big house and the little house. This, I'm going to show a lot of pictures for this one particular house because it was such a pivotal project and really turned the tide. They had to get rid of the inappropriate additions, including this brick gymnasium on the back. And banks would not loan down here. We could not get loans. When Jim and I went to get a loan for our house a few years later than this, they didn't even deny redlining. They said, oh, no, that's a red line neighborhood. We went to 3 different banks, and finally the third one, Jim got an appointment with the senior vice president of loans, and he made a formal presentation, slide presentation on historic preservation and what Lockerbie could be to Indianapolis. And that's what got us the first loan to do a project down here. Bob and Helen had to do most of the work themselves and on credit cards and whatever money they could get. Here's Helen, and she's sitting there with Carolyn Bradbury, who also did a house very early on, and you'll see it in a few minutes. But, you know, they shoveled into wheelbarrows and hauled off that gymnasium. Here it is still with a little bit of the gymnasium left. Here it is with the house coming back to its original footprint. Now, when you go on a walking tour, you see the outside of the houses, but I can't help myself. I had to show you the inside of this house as well, because you see the Herculean job it took to bring it back outside. Let's talk about what happened inside. You see these beautiful floors with all this inlaid oak, the oak floors with inlay cherry and walnut. The whole first floor was full of this. And it was covered with most disgusting linoleum, very early style linoleum that was put down with 1/4 inch of a substance that looked like tar. And Helen Small took a wallpaper steamer. And if you've ever used a wallpaper steamer, it's about the size of a small computer or an 8.5, whatever. And you lay it down and you heat it up. And she would lay it down on the floor, and she figured out, trial and error, but she figured out how long she had to leave it there to get it soft enough to scrape off with a putty knife, and then would move it to the next one, get it soft, scrape it off, move it to the next one, scrape it off. So she got all of that putty off those floors. And then Bob sanded them and refinished them. And look how beautiful they are today. Now, I don't know if you can tell, these are 2 pictures. It's divided right here. This is right over here. This is the paneling in the wood paneling in the stairwell with the newel posts and all the fretwork. This was all painted a very disgusting industrial green paint. And I cannot imagine, even when she was doing it, how many hours it took Helen to strip that green paint off to get this beautiful original woodwork. Here is the house today. Helen and Bob raised their family in it. And then in 2013, they moved across the street to a smaller house to age in place, fix it up and age in place. and Heather Willie bought it. And then she's taken it to the next level and done additional renovations and restoration. Here is the little house next door. This is the Despa house. It was built in, oh, my papers are not with me. It was built in 1863 and was one of the earliest houses, just right after the during the Civil War, 1863. It was a painter. And again, let me just say, you know, the tradesmen lived next door to the big houses. It didn't matter. And you can see this is the back side of the house right here. And they had to take off that addition that connected the two houses. And here's this kind of rusted chain link fence around where the kids played. Ken and Diana Stroud tackled restoring this house. Here it is today. When we moved here from Washington, D.C., Jim was wandering around one weekend while I was still in D.C. trying to find a place for us to live. And Diana came out of the house and started talking to him. And the bottom line was, by the end of that conversation, she had convinced him that we wanted to move to Lockerbie and restore a house. Now, in 1973, old and new residents, is what our history says, formed the Lockerbie Square People's Club. There are residents, or were residents then, that had families that had lived here, moved in the 40s and the 50s. There's one that moved in the 50s that's still here today. This was not gentrification. We didn't move anybody out. We just moved into the empty houses and boarded up houses and empty lots and brought the neighborhood back. So the old and the new residents pulled together to form the neighborhood association. And that's why it's called Lockerbie Square People's Club, because we wanted it to be inclusive. Whether you rented, whether you owned, whether you were an urban pioneer restoring a house, you know, whatever, we wanted you to be part of the neighborhood association. So it was entitled, until just recently, Lockerbie Square People's Club. Recently, the board changed it to Lockerbie Square Neighborhood Association. Now, Dr. Glass wrote in our history that in 1973, both old and new residents of Lockerbie Square founded the Lockerbie Square People's Club in order to combat more effectively some of the physical problems afflicting the neighborhood from years of neglect and deterioration. I kind of laughed when I saw that. So Jim did a delightful way of saying, this is what we did because we had a huge rat population. Think about it. Boarded up old houses. A lot of the houses had trash strewn and piled up in the yards. You know, it attracted rodents. So again, the neighbors got together. They went to the city. They asked Landmarks, I believe, to go with them, but they went to the city and they said, you know, they got help and we got rid of the rats. We really did. We got rid of the rats, but you know what? We kept the People's Club. And today we have a picnic in the side yard for the 4th of July, the side yard of the Riley home for the 4th of July. And we've done that for now actually generations since the 70s. We have a yard and garage sale the 3rd week of Saturday of September every year. We hope we can have it this year. Last year was the first because of the pandemic that we couldn't. But we not only open up our yards and garages and sell stuff, but we have, as you can see in this picture, we now have added tents for antique dealers and artists, etc. We have musicians that go around through the neighborhood. We have a beer garden and we have food trucks and we have fun. We also have Locktoberfest to celebrate our German heritage. And we have a Christmas pitch-in, huge pitch-in. Everybody in the neighborhood comes to that and brings a dish to share. Now, Indiana Landmarks stepped into, you know, now that they were getting people moving into the neighborhood, fixing up, they did flip houses is what they called them back then. They would come in and restore a house and then flip it to a new owner. That they now call it the real estate committee, but we still refer to a lot of our houses down here as the flip houses. This is, most of the neighbors call this the Holler House. It was a good German, Holler House. It was built by George Holler in 1863, who was a German-born plasterer. This is what it looked like in the late 70s before they started restoring it. In 1970, probably started working on it 74. And 75, then they got 75, 76. It was the field, it was restored, and it was used as the field office for the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee and the Indianapolis Bicentennial Committee. Now, we're always talking about the bicentennial, but we're talking today about the bicentennial of Indianapolis. Think about it, 1976 was the bicentennial for our country. That was the before and after. Also, as a bicentennial project, the Indianapolis Department of Transportation re-cobblestoned Lockerbie Street, the 500 block of Lockerbie Street. I'll show you in later slides, but some of the original cobblestones are over here in the gutters. And then they put new cobblestone, and well, this had asphalt on it, and they took the asphalt off, put new cobblestones with concrete. And I've even seen big moving trucks move up and down the street. It's pretty sturdy. You see pictures of young couples during the warm, nice weather when it's beautiful outside. I've seen them when there's been more than one couple at a time. The photographers come to take engagement pictures. And then on Saturdays or Friday nights, wedding parties. You'll see a limo will pull up and the wedding party gets out on the cobblestone and gets their picture taken, or horse-drawn carriages or the trolley, whatever. They want to get these beautiful trees, which were originally planted by the garden club, but have continued to be replaced when they die off by our neighborhood association. My favorite wedding story is that we had a couple in the neighborhood get married. And so they hired Pork and Beans, which is a New Orleans style band. And they started at East Street, and they invited the whole neighborhood to come out and do a first line with them, which is, you know, like in New Orleans, you have your white handkerchief, you're over your head and whatever. And so we danced down Lockerbie Street behind the Pork and Beans band, and then behind the wedding party. We get to where it dead ends, then into Park Street. And for about an hour, we just moved traffic. We just told people, go away. And we blocked off the intersection. We drank champagne and danced to the music. And that's a true Lockerbie story. We had a couple who had lived in Lockerbie and that week had moved back and said, this is why we missed Lockerbie. Now, this says, what happened to that house? Well, what happened to that house? Before I go on, let me just say, look, this is Lockerbie Street right here. Here you can see the original cobblestone, and you can see the asphalt that was pulled up and they re-cobblestoned. But Helen's house was on this corner, Ellen and Bob, and Helen looked across the street and she saw this backhoe taking down this beautiful little cottage. And she was like, no, don't do that. So that's when they got landmarks to work with them in the neighborhood, the president and Helen and other people. And they went to the city to say, please do not tear down our houses, even if they have demolition numbers on them. So then we had to figure out what to do. And the group, I just realized I've missed a really important detail when I talked about the neighborhood association, because this group that went to the city one of the people that Helen, I always attributed our neighborhood Lockerbie Square People's Club to Helen. And Helen said, no, she helped, but it was really Jean Spears. And Jean Spears was down here and moved shortly after we did our house, but she really got the neighborhood association going, and she worked in projects on it. And then she went to Ransom Place and started over trying to get to revitalize the neighborhood. Ransom Place spoke to her African-American roots. She has since passed on, but both Ransom Place and Lockerbie remember her fondly. But anyhow, the neighborhood association and neighbors went and tried to say, don't tear down any more houses. So we then went to Landmarks to say, what can we do? And we formed a special corporation that was Indiana Landmarks and neighbors that would buy interest in this corporation to rescue houses that are of the same period and move them to Lockerbie. Here is the first house that we moved to Lockerbie. You can see it coming down the street, and you can see it moved back over the new foundation. We have a full, huge, deep concrete block basement. This is my house. This is my husband standing there overseeing it. It was the first house moved in. Of course, you always learn something when you do something the first time. The thing we learned was the cheapest bid is not always the best. As they rolled the house back over the new foundation, they had two big rails, and one of the rails was welded, and the weld broke. The house tipped and fell down into the foundation, knocking the foundation down. They had to jack the house back up, rebuild the foundation, and then rebuild the brick around it. We did not lose much. All the gingerbread still stayed on the outside of the house, but on the inside of the house, this is my living room ceiling. We got a few cracks that we've repaired. The ceiling was also painted, and it fell. We shoveled it into buckets, and we saved a few pieces of it, and we found out later when we found this under 26 layers of wallpaper and paint, we went back and looked at those pieces, and indeed the dining room ceiling had been painted. This is my house today. It is an 1872 Carpenter Gothic. It was built by Frederick Fout, and I would just like to say there's a lot I can tell you about it, but I don't want to take the time, but I will tell you that Frederick Fout was one of 4 Congressional Medal honor winners for the Civil War from Indiana. There were only 4 in Indiana, and one of them was the man who built our house. We moved in a second house, and we've moved in 5 houses. This was the 3rd house we moved in. I wanted to share it because it's important. It was built by the 3rd governor, Governor James Brown Ray. He built it after he was governor, when he went back to being an attorney, and it was built on Pearl and Alabama Street, which is where our, okay, I thought somebody was trying to tell me I was doing so. It's where the current jail is. So when they built the jail, they moved it to St. Peter's Street. And in 1977, the owner wanted to tear it down in St. Peter's Street. So he sold it to the city, who then worked with Landmarks, and we moved it to the corner of Park and New York Streets. Here it is restored back to, and the first person to own it was James Nice. And he was a mechanical engineer, and he went out and found historic glass so that he could replace any broken panes with 100-year-old glass. Later, a carriage house of its own time was attached with a breezeway in between. It's currently owned and faithfully cared for by Patsy and Bob Cram. Now, here's the 3rd house I'm going to show you that we moved in. Here's that lot where the house disappeared. And so we found a house on Washington Street that was going to be torn down for tax. He didn't want to pay taxes on it, so he was going to tear it down. And it was the same footprint. So here it is. We've moved it to this lot, and here it is restored. Here it is restored, and look at that. it's connected to the house next door. What is that all about? Well, here's the house next door. 3 women bought it and they wanted to restore it and flip it. Melissa Goldsmith, Brenda Houston, and Lorraine Price. They were doing flips before HGTV came on. A friend of mine that's a speech pathologist, she came by to help us paint one day, and we went for a walk, and she went through the house. You can see it's done. Well, it was almost done. It was about 80% done when she went through it, and she said, I want to live there. And so she bought the house, and then she lived in this house. Larry Wallace, an attorney in town, had restored this house. And then living side by side, they got to going out. Then they dated. Then they decided to get married. So they said to the commission, if we can connect our house, we will get married. I'm not sure the commission would allow this today. I don't know. But they did then. And they connected the house. And so they got married in the side lawn, and the neighborhood all came. That's another Lockerbie Square story. So we moved in houses and restored them to get Lockerbie revitalized, but we still weren't getting many people building new houses. This new house was part of the Day Nursery project. It was Justice DeBruler's, designed by H. Roll McLaughlin. Roll McLaughlin and Justice DeBruler both died in 2017. They sold the house to Christy and Joby Norris, who had lived across the street for a number of years, and Christy had been one of our neighborhood association presidents, and they're now restoring it and have moved in. But it took a long time. I mean, trying to get people to build new houses. We had one other, but then the big one came in 1979. This is the lot right here where I'm showing you. This house is beautifully restored today. This house is beautifully restored, but you can see back then it took some guts to buy this lot and build this house. And not only did it take guts and vision to do it, but it was done by Tom Binford. Tom Binford was a highly recognized mover and shaker for Indianapolis. And in 1985, while he lived there, the Indianapolis Business Journal said he was the most active corporate director in 1985. So not only having the new house in the neighborhood, but who built it gave us credibility to our revitalization. Now, I could do a whole series on new houses that happened over the next 20 years, but I don't have time. So I'm just going to jump straight ahead to 1999, almost 2000. This is a parking lot on the corner of Vermont and College. It was an asphalt parking lot for over 50 years. Originally, it was a little shotgun house built in 1859 before the Civil War, but it had long been an asphalt parking lot. Kathy Willing, who's a member of the Propylaeum, the member who brought me in as a member, she and her husband, Don, bought this parking lot and hired Valentine and Williamson, an architect that was a good friend of ours who unfortunately passed away from cancer right before the project was completed. But she designed it in Italianesque style. And Tom Jones, who was a builder who did historic-esque new houses in the Old North Side, Chatham Arch, and Lockerbie, built it. Now, Kathy sent me a ton of information on this house, and I apologize, I can't share all of it. I don't have time. I will say that all the wood trim, floors, paneling was all American cherry, and that was impressive to me, Kathy. Also, just inside the main entrance, they had a chandelier, an antique chandelier that they got from a house in Kentucky. It was originally half gas, half electric, which is what they did back when we were transitioning from gas to electric. Today, it's all electric. Kathy and Dawn recently moved to a house that they could more easily age in place, and sold it, and they took the chandelier with them. Thank you, Kathy. Here's another picture, and it will be hanging in the Propylaeum soon. Real quickly, about the same time as they did their house, another one was done on the other side of the square on the corner of Vermont and East Street. And this was Andre Lacey and his wife, Julia. Andre Lacey was the CEO of Lacey Diversified Industries and the chairman of the board until he also passed in 2017. Julia had been a very active member in our neighborhood association. She passed the year before, but you can see it was, I'm telling you, there were seas and seas and seas of parking lots around here. Like Firehouse Square, if you know where that is, it was all a big parking lot everywhere you went. And I am convinced that had we not had the Day Nursery project and the other few neighbors who came in to do their houses, Lockerbie would look like this. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly now. We've got a lot of new houses, but it took a long time. It would never have happened. We would never have gotten the new houses if we hadn't restored the old houses. So here are two houses on East Street. They were both built by William Kienle in 1876 after the Civil War. Indiana Landmarks owned both of these. They sold this one to an architect, Terry Bradbury, and his wife, Carolyn. They restored it and raised their family there. This one was restored a little later than the Bradburys and was done by here's the back of the Bradburys, was done by the Phi Kappa Psi National Headquarters. They faithfully returned the exterior of this house to what it was when it was first built. So you can see this is coming a long way. Around the corner on Vermont, this was done by Dennis and Patty Wright. I said to Patty, you know, I can see the paint peeling, but it didn't look quite as bad as some of the others. She said, oh, you didn't see the inside. It was bad. They restored this house. They came in either 73 or 75, and they raised their family there. They came in 75. This one is a little later, 1982. Jim Oberfeld was a teacher at Cathedral High School. This one was early. This was in the early 70s. Clyde Chasteen and his wife. He was one of the early presidents of our neighborhood association. Across the street from the Chasteens was this double. And the three women did this one as well. Look at this. I mean, you know, you really have to be ambitious to bring it back to what it was. And it's two houses. It's a double, and two families. A family owns each side. This little house is on Lockerbie Street across from the James Whitcomb Riley, and next door, Tina's is over here. It was restored by Don Bollinger. He was assistant fire chief, and he worked at part-time on weekends and restored this house. He also did a double he lived in down the street, because he turned this into what we've always called the watch shop, because Don was a master watchmaker, and he had this for a number of years as the watch shop. Today, it is a residence. Now, quickly, if you walk through our neighborhood and you're on Park Street, peek up the alley, Vermont Place, and you see this. We call it the Peak Nut Factory. When T.R. Fletcher laid out that part, he wanted this to be a park, but it never became a park. It was a lumber yard. And then later it became, this building was built in 1912, and it was an express parcel delivery. And then it became a machine shop. Then it was the Peak Nut wholesaler. And then it was a cabinet maker. And in 1985, 86, it became 15 apartments. So I think it's just delightful. Don't miss it. On College, this was a gas station built in 1929. We always called it the radiator shop because that's what it was in the 70s. It's an office today. This is my last slide. I apologize that we have this is not a good one, but I couldn't find a good shot of this. When we first moved our house, both my husband's parents and my parents came over from Columbus, Ohio, different weekends, but they both had the same horrified reaction. They just couldn't believe we were going to, live in this house. We restored it before we moved in, but my father-in-law looked out the front window and he said, "Do you guys realize there's a used car lot across the street?" And I said, "Yes, but it won't always be a used car lot. It'll be beautiful housing someday." Never in my wildest dreams did I think it would take over 35 to 40 years before these townhouses showed up, but it's very beautiful today. So I hope you come to Lockerbie when the weather gets good and you can feel like you want to get out, and you can walk through our streets. You can ride your bike through our streets. You can dance down our street. And when you're done, you can walk over past St. Mary's to the Point Tavern and have a glass of wine and enjoy your walk. If you go to huneyindy.org, you will find that you can click on it and you can see it's hard to read this slide, but historic urban neighborhoods of Indianapolis, we have done these tours for other neighborhoods, and you can now walk through and see. They'll tell you the history of each house, and you can do these walking tours. I'm just going to say not all of them will have the befores like we have.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. That was incredible. What a great program. I have just a couple of questions. The first one is, you showed so many houses, and it really is incredible. So besides your own, do you have a favorite home in Lockerbie?
Oh, it's funny when you say beside my own, because I have to say that when the lottery was up to like 300, some ridiculous amount, we bought a lottery ticket, and Jim said, "What will you do if we win that? We'll have to move." And I said, "Oh, but I don't want to win. Mm-hmm. I don't want to move out of my house." So it's definitely my favorite. I think, I love Tina's house, the one I showed you that was the first house built in mm-hmm. Lockerbie. It's beautiful inside, and I just feel so good when I'm in there. I love Bob and Helen's house, because I have great memories of it. When we were working on our house, I showed you the Lockerbie Fair and the parking lot. They had torn down the houses on New York Street. That's why we had to move 3 of them in on New York Street, because that was going to be the parking lot. So when we went to restore our house, they couldn't find the water. They had disconnected the water. They thought it was going to be a parking lot. We didn't get water till the week before we moved in. So we had to do painting, plastering, wallpaper, steaming, drywalling. All of that had to be done by carrying buckets from Bob and Helen's house, a block and a half away. So we practically lived there during the year we restored our house, carrying buckets, and Helen and Bob always had a pot of coffee on for us. And they also had, and I'm sorry, I was so many stores. It was the Day Nursery, and they had to do this over time because they couldn't get a big loan to come in and do it. So in the bathroom upstairs, they had a regular toilet, adult toilet, but they also still had, for a time period, the little toilets, 3 or 4 little teeny tiny toilets, just hardly off the floor. But that's, mm-hmm. That's one of my favorite houses too, because it has such warm memories. And the Bradbury house, I have such warm memories. And the Wrights, I mean, it's hard. It's not just the architecture, it's the people.